Okay, so now that we talked about what limited and what protected and unprotected speech, we talked about the vague provisions from the beginning. We talked about challenges to assembly and association through those vague provisions. Let's kind of put it all together in a diagram to really kind of show what it is. So we identify the defect, which is again is vague provisions, exemption clause, all-encompassing laws, defective legislation really throughout, and because they create disproportionate leverage of authoritative discretion, which gives authorities really such broad parameters that a large majority of things can be placed under that scope. Now, at best, that produces a rate that's inconsistent, that produces results that's inconsistent. At worst, it produces authoritative, abuse of authoritative discretion or abuse of authority. Now, in either case, it is defective legislation and needs to be amended. Again, these have resulted in what? They have resulted in challenges for what we see, which is assembly and association, and also in challenges, especially in political and ideological speech. How? By limiting protected speech and by expanding unprotected speech. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the grander issue at hand. Again, these defective laws are all-encompassing and they touch more than the prisoners of conscience. In fact, they are so large that really, because of the high corruption level in really in all aspects of the countries, whether it's even local governments, whether it's institutions, whether it's in its direct business, what this can do is it can lead anyone with local influence to place such charges as a means of advantage or personal vendetta. So really, when we talk about these laws, is they're not limited to simply being used on the prisoners of conscience. They can be used at any point, at any time, on numerous scales. So again, we have talked about the prisoners of conscience because that's political and it's publicized, but what about the cases that are not? This is why it's so important to address the law. And the reason is when we address the law, we are able to basically cover individuals who are not known to us. Okay, again, there are many people, for example, that question, that prescribe to the ideology that there are no prisoners of conscience in the country, in Algeria. Well, based on our analysis of the law, the question of status is really a trivial matter, whether it's political or not, whether they're prisoners of conscience or not. The law is defective by nature, and so inherently it infringes on fundamental rights. And so we need to basically halt these laws, review these laws, and amend. And we need to do this, we need to focus on the law so that we avoid basically a revolving door. It's not free these and put some other people in, right? We see these laws are defective by nature. So this is not even an issue of are these prisoners of conscience or not. The law is defective by nature, it infringes by nature. At best, it is inconsistent and it is unjust. At worst, it's abusive. In either case, the law has to be amended. And by amending the law, you would be able to address everyone that has it on record, which means these individuals that perhaps through corruption, perhaps through someone placing personal vendetta, or whatever the case may be, that are not political, that was used on them, okay, those can be addressed as well. Or perhaps individual that's family or themselves are too scared, or whatever the case may be. We have to address everyone's freedom. Okay, so now when we're talking about vague definition and international comparative, we really want to talk about Article 87, or the terrorism charge in Algeria. And is it just an issue to Algeria, or is that an issue generally overall when it comes to international definition of terrorism? So really, one can do their own research. They have courses, they have classes, they even have degrees in the matter. The situation is not as easy as 1, 2, 3 in explaining. However, what you will find is that it's highly political. And there are laws, that several around the world, that are very vague. And this is the problem when it does turn into the term terrorism. Here, for example, EU, for example, is actually quite vague if you read it. And I talk about the framework decision on combating terrorism in 2002, which identifies terrorism as activities with an aim of serious intimidating a population or unduly compelling a government or international organization to perform or abstain from performing any act, or seriously destabilizing or destroying the fundamental political, constitutional, economic, or social structure of a country or an international organization. So you can quite see this is very vague to simply say unduly, simply say overly, or to simply say out of the ordinary. This again, the security aspect isn't even here. The violence aspect isn't even here. So again, anything can be really encompassed by this. It's such a general definition. By contrast, when you look at, for example, Canada, where it clearly places security in there, places economic security and others, but it does place security on there. Same with the US. The British definition says designed to influence the government or intimidate the public or a section of the public, and made for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, or ideological cause. So there seems to be the premise that it has to push a political perspective, and also that it's use of intimidation. So this is the very vague provision of terrorism. So again, this is why we have to be very careful, especially people who are making the slogans, especially people who have influence online, is we have to be careful. A lot of us are not in Algeria, we're outside of Algeria, people who are going to get in trouble. It's not us, it's others. So we have to take heed. We have to be very responsible in our words. We have to decipher to ensure that what we are saying, what we are influencing other people to say, is not going to place them in further danger, or is not going to place them in a situation where they are breaking the law. Because quite obviously, these legal terminology do get a little bit on, they're very blurry. Okay, and especially Article 87. So for this reason, when we actually went to the UPR, when I went to speak to, of course, diplomats, part of the UPR process is you speak to diplomats to make recommendations. Now, this is not let's go badmouth Algeria time. This is to give feedback. Feedback in the UPR is it's not supposed to be a name or shame event. It's supposed to be where we give precise feedback. Feedback is given in a format where you give one positive, one negative, and a recommendation to address the negative. So with what we had before, we did this recommendation, which is again a recommendation to review a vague provision and exemption clause in the Algerian constitution and penal code that induce disproportionate leverage of authoritative discretion and limit political and ideological speech. This is a very, very vague thing, right? Because even though it addresses the problem, when it comes to recommendations, we have to give not only recommendations, you have to break it down. You have to give recommendations, and it has to be objectives. From objectives, you break it down to targets and, of course, immediate actions. So when we're saying stuff, this is why it's so important we identify the exact problems, we identify the same legislation, not only the legislation, but exact excerpts that are the issue. And so when you are speaking to nations, of course, to working group, and you have to take heed and you have to be very careful, because we are human rights, but there is the concept of geopolitics. Unfortunately, we cannot operate in a vacuum. And we have to recognize that. We cannot operate in a vacuum. So you have to take heed who you're speaking to, what are their priorities, and what you say. It is the nature of the beast, if you will. And people's words can definitely be skewed. So given that case, we made sure that it is organized so that it is designed for acceptance and designed for improvement. Our point of this is to actually improve the situation for people in Algeria, or for people in prison. So it is not adversarial, and of course it is not fanned out of control. If you give something that's really general, it's hard for you to then later on measure. So when you're doing objectives, it has to be timely, it has to be measurable. So within the case, what we did is create objectives, and you can clearly see them here, and they address exact issues, which is, of course, information deemed to be offensive or undermining authoritative interests. We put those exact slogans on there. We put, of course, the famous articles that you see over and over again, people's allegations. which is Article 87 bis. 13 and 14, Articles 87 bis, is a very large article, and we have to make sure that we're choosing the right provision. We also have Article 95 in here, and you can quite see that we were very specific. And later on, you can almost tell who we spoke to because you can see them mirrored. So it is a good thing because again, depends who you go to and how you speak to them, but you can definitely see results if you produce accurate data, exact objectives, and of course you have resources. What we have here is what we call the roadmap, right? So basically moving forward, basically the Algerian civil society, or this portion of the UPR, it's Algerian civil society and the government, basically the parliament, have to decipher through the recommendations. You have over 291 recommendations. It's a bit absurd or ridiculous to expect a nation to just stop and hold everything and just take on what the world wants it to do. That would not be democratic even. And so it has to go through parliament, but it has to go through several layers of filtering. So how does that help us? Well, it helps us because this portion, this is not specially to us, this is not a strategy, this is how the UPR works in general, is you look through those recommendations, take precisely which ones you agree with, or which countries definitely made the recommendations that you proposed, and later on you send your recommendations, you send which ones you want to Parliament. This is the process. And so, for example, although the UPR largely was misrepresentative of the Algerian population and general wants and needs, there are several countries that did make the necessary recommendations. Not only made the necessary recommendations, but made them with the right provisions in there. As in Article 87 bis, 1314, as if the quote, undermining national authority, those exact provisions that we are having issues with today in Algeria were mentioned. Remember, this is not a time, and we have to be careful from countries who are politicizing the mechanism. This is not an area where it's just bad-mouthing or shaming Algeria. This is providing a roadmap in public, and it is a platform that both respects sovereignty, which is quite important, and as well as protects civil society. Later on in this process is we have exactly which recommendations were accepted by Algeria, and basically that's our advocacy moving forward, is when we help with the action plan. Civil society's role is not just say this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. Civil society's role is to actually come up with an action plan, detailed, and to help out with the process. Of course, government has to accept, government has to be willing, but again, that is part of the process. Nonetheless, now it turns our advocacy, we can hike it up a notch, and it becomes a bit more sophisticated, because we can simply say, well, with recommendation 6.1442 that was made by Belgium or whatnot, this is still not done. Algeria has accepted it, blah, blah, blah. So that's how you start to organize things. We do have the roadmap. We do have certain nations that definitely made. We have a necessary detailed recommendation, Article 87. We have on arbitrary detention and release of detainees. We have a recommendation on pretrial detention. We have recommendation on freedom of expression, assembly, and even gender equality. So we have quite a bit that were very, very detailed, enough to be a roadmap for us to follow through.